Hello, everyone. Welcome to Apostles of Reason. Today we're going to be doing a tier list for arguments for God's existence. And I've done a tier list for atheist arguments in which I might have not proposed very convincing alternatives to some arguments. So today I'll be trying to do my best to be fair. And I'm a Protestant Christian, so this is going to be coming from my subjective perspective. And there's generally 6 categories of arguments for God's existence, which I'm going to go over here. A lot of the academic discussion is focused on Kant's big 3 arguments. So that's ontological, cosmological, and teleological arguments. And there's many variations of those arguments, but I'm going to be talking about some of the most popular and common versions. Now, there's categories of apologetics as well, which the ontological, cosmological, teleological, and moral argument fall under philosophical apologetics, and the first 3 can be combined under the umbrella of classical apologetics, which is combined with the historical argument for the deity of Christ. And so there's a few ways to attack this. We're just going to go one by one for these arguments. And we're going to start with the very first one, which is the ontological argument. According to Bertrand Russell, the ontological argument is sound. However, he later criticized the argument, asserting that, quote, the argument does not, to a modern mind, seem very convincing, but it is easier to feel convinced that it must be fallacious than it is to find out precisely where the fallacy lies. And so what he's basically saying is the ontological argument plays on our human intuitions to a degree that we can't explain why it's wrong. It feels right. Or I guess to the contrary, he's saying it is sound, logically speaking, but it feels wrong to him. So it's one of those arguments that's been in a common debate in previous centuries. So one of the most popular versions of this argument is Anselm's argument, where he claimed to derive the existence of God from the concept of a being which no greater can be conceived. And so he reasoned that if such a being fails to exist, then a greater being, namely a being which no greater can be conceived, and which exists, can be conceived. But this would be absurd. Nothing can be greater than a being that which no greater can be conceived. So a being than which no greater can be conceived, i.e., God, exists. Again, not very convincing for a lot of people because it sounds like just semantics. But essentially, what the idea is, that which nothing greater can be thought of is understood. Whatever is understood exists in understanding. So that which nothing greater can be thought exists in understanding. It is one thing for something to exist in understanding and quite another for it to exist in reality. And it is greater for something to exist in understanding and reality than in understanding alone. And now, Augustine had a lot of common ontological arguments. One of his most popular ones is immutable truth, where he claims immutable truth is superior to the human mind and consequently a legitimate candidate for the role of God. Clearly, there is such a thing as immutable truth. So either that is God, or there is something superior to immutable truth, and that superior thing is God. So a lot of these arguments aren't convincing to a lot of people. Famously, Kant claimed that ontological arguments are vitiated by their reliance upon the implicit assumption that existence is a real predicate. And Bertrand Russell observed it's much easier to be persuaded that ontological arguments are no good than it is to say exactly what's wrong with them. So it's a pretty interesting argument. I would have to put it in the middle at a B situation. Some people would be convinced by it just by the mere definitions of what our conception of good is and how great we can conceive of something, and if we can think of it, it exists, that sort of thing. Not the best argument in the world for most people. Next, we have the cosmological arguments. Now, this is where you use a pattern of inferences from particular alleged facts about the universe to the existence of a unique being, generally identified with or referred to as God. Now, there's a lot of different formulations of cosmological arguments. We have the argument from a non-contingent cause, argument from a weak principle of sufficient reason, argument from a strong principle of sufficient reason. We have the Kalam cosmological. There's several others, but I'll just give you the Kalam cosmological argument, which has been recently fairly popular. William Lane Craig is famous for defending this argument. So it's just a 5-step argument. Premise 1, everything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Premise 3, therefore the universe has a cause of its existence. Premise 4, no scientific explanation can provide a causal account of the origin of the universe, since such are a part of the universe. And conclusion, therefore, the cause must be personal, an explanation that is given in terms of a non-natural personal agent. So to show some support for the first premise that everything that begins to exist must have a cause, let's take a look at Hilbert's Hotel, which is a common example used to justify this premise. So you imagine that you have an infinite hotel, and there's a hotel with infinitely many rooms in it. You need a room, but the only problem is the receptionist tells you that the hotel is fully occupied, and now he needs to find a room for you. But the receptionist is clever, and he tells the guests in room 1 to move to room 2, and the one in room 2 to room 3, and in general, the guests always move up 1. We can imagine they all move rooms at the same time. When that's done, there's a room available at room 1, and all guests are accommodated. Great. What this thought experiment shows is that infinity plus 1 is still infinity. So in a fully booked hotel with infinitely many rooms, you can always find room for one more. And what this proves is that there's a metaphysical absurdity of an actually infinite number of things existing, which precludes the possibility of a beginningless past. So it essentially just claims that an infinite regress of causes is not possible for the beginning of time. There needs to be a singular cause because it's metaphysically impossible to have an infinite number of things existing in reality. This sort of argument, I think, again, kind of plays on intuition. It's a philosophical argument, so some people might not be convinced of it. I think it is stronger than the ontological argument because we're taking a look at the lack of scientific evidence for any explanation for the cause of the universe existing. So I think it is a little bit better. People might argue some God of the gaps reasoning here, but I think it's an A. It's higher than ontological. I don't think ontological is C. Okay, teleological. Now, the teleological arguments are attempts to best explain how many cosmological constants are so precisely set, so it'd be like the fine-tuning. Now, the teleological argument generally reflects 3 possibilities for the existence of the fine-tuning, which would be law, chance, or design. And scientists have puzzled over it for years. There's no natural laws that account for this, and let me just give you a few of these constants that we are talking about here. We have the strong nuclear force constant, the weak nuclear force constant, gravitational force constant, electromagnetic force constant, ratio of electromagnetic force constant to gravitational force constant, ratio of proton to electron mass, ratio of number of protons to number of electrons, ratio of proton to electron charge, expansion rate of the universe, mass density of the universe, baryon density of the universe, space energy or dark energy density of the universe, ratio of space energy density to mass density, entropy level of the universe, velocity of light, age of the universe, uniformity of radiation, homogeneity of the universe, averages between galaxies. And there's another over 60 constants here. Actually, over 80. So the total is like over 92. And so Stephen Hawking, who was originally a believer in a theory of everything, which could possibly explain the fine-tuning as necessary by law, after considering Gödel's theorem, concluded that that one was not obtainable. He states, quote, "Some people would be very disappointed if there is not an ultimate theory that can be formulated as a finite number of principles. I used to belong to that camp, but I have changed my mind." Since the threshold of mathematical impossibility is 1 in 10 to the 50th power, and the odds of this fine-tuning coming into existence by chance are far, far beyond that, we can rule out chance. Only a transcendent creator makes sense of this unbelievably complex order in the universe. Now, we also know through modern science that life-prohibiting universes are vastly more probable than life-permitting universes like ours. How much more probable would be the question? And the answer is that chances that the universe should be life-permitting are so infinitesimally small as to be incomprehensible and incalculable. For example, Stephen Hawking has estimated that if the rate of the universe's expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million, the universe would have recollapsed into a hot fireball due to gravitational attraction. Then we have physicist P.C.W. Davies, who calculated that the odds against the initial conditions being suitable for star formation is 1 followed by at least 1,000 billion zeros. He also calculated that a change in the strength of gravity or of the weak force by merely 1 part in 10 raised to the 100th power would have prevented a life-permitting universe. There's dozens and dozens of these constants and quantities represented in the Big Bang that are finely tuned in ratio to one another along with independently fine-tuned. And so, again, it's an exponentially unlikely equation when you have to equate all the ratios to a perfect fine-tuning situation here. And then we have PCW Davies, who comments, through my scientific work, I have come to believe more and more strongly that the physical universe is put together with an ingenuity so astounding that I cannot accept it as merely a brute fact. And then we have Sir Frederick Hoyle, who is a British astrophysicist. He remarked, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics. And then Robert Jastrow, the head of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, refers to this as, quote, the most powerful evidence for the existence of God ever to come out of science. Okay, teleological is one of the best arguments ever created for the existence of God. I think it's convincing on its own. Okay, next we have the experiential argument. Now, these arguments are not logical or philosophical. It's generally giving their people's testimony with experiencing the love of God and their relationship with Jesus Christ. So there is a reason why people share their testimony. It can be convincing. Anecdotes are convincing. That's why there's journalists. That's why storytellers are so popular. And, an example of an experiential argument would be someone who struggled with drug addiction or a lack of hope, and they found Christ, and they might share their experiences of hopelessness and how, after forging a relationship with Christ, they're now fulfilled, and them sharing that with a group of people who might have felt similarly to how they felt before they found Christ. Now, I think in certain circumstances, this is powerful. But, if we're just spreading it out to, convincing in general, as an argument, I think it's good to supplement, philosophical reasoning with an experiential argument. And so, in isolation, experiential arguments aren't that strong to me. But I think in combination with other arguments, they're good. So, I would put it probably just in the middle at a B situation. Next, we have the pragmatic approach. So these approaches look at how belief in God positively affects the world. Belief in God was behind the major scientific discoveries of the 14th century, and this is due to the belief that an ordered and rational God instilled order and rationality into the universe. Also, religion teaches a framework of morality and ethics and other behaviors that are beneficial to society, like peace and justice. Religious communities also provide a social support network and community, and this would involve emotional and spiritual support along with material assistance. Charitable activities are often promoted among religious communities. The Catholic Church is the largest non-governmental provider of education and medical services in the world. Religious communities are often generally advocates of healthy lifestyles, like abstaining from drugs and promoting purity. Cultural preservation is also very important, depending on the specific religious community. For example, the Catholic Church is a very strong cultural tradition which has spanned over 2,000 years. Now, I think this approach can backfire. It's one of my least favorite approaches, but I think, honestly, that's an argument for Christianity rather than for God. I think it would work better to use it as an argument for Christianity as opposed to just God exists. I think the philosophical arguments do better for God's existence. This is either a C or a B. I don't... in isolation, it's better than the experiential argument, but in cumulation, I don't think it helps that much, really. I think it's a side sort of argument, so it's kind of in between, But I'll just rank it below, so we'll go left to right. It's a little bit below experiential. And the last one we're going to talk about today is the historical argument. Now, historical arguments are generally focusing on Jesus' resurrection and historical documents surrounding Jesus' resurrection. And they basically use this to validate Jesus' deity, which also would prove the existence of God. So it's not a theory about the cosmological makeup of the universe. It's historically documented events. And so it relies on interpretation of the historical evidence. Now, we do have 4 almost universally agreed upon facts of the New Testament that scholars agree upon. So the first fact would be that after his crucifixion, Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in the tomb. And this fact is very significant because it means the location of Jesus' tomb was known to Jews and Christians, because Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Sanhedrin. So in that case, it doesn't make sense how the resurrection could arise in the face of a tomb that would still contain his corpse. Now, the second fact would be on the Sunday morning following the crucifixion, the tomb of Jesus was found empty by a group of his women followers. According to Jacob Kremer, an Austrian specialist on the resurrection, quote, by far, most exegetes hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements concerning the empty tomb. So it's generally agreed upon by scholars of the New Testament that the tomb of Jesus, empty, was found by a group of his women followers. Third fact would be that on multiple occasions and under various circumstances, different individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive from the dead. Now, this is a fact that's almost universally acknowledged among New Testament scholars. Even Gert Ludemann, who is perhaps one of the most prominent current critics of the resurrection, admits, quote, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. And the fourth fact is the original disciples believed that Jesus was risen from the dead despite their having every reason not to. So, despite having every predisposition to the contrary, it is an undeniable historical fact that the original disciples believed in, proclaimed, and were willing to go to their deaths for the fact of Jesus' resurrection. This is after they went into hiding after Jesus' death, and they were hiding away from the world. Okay, in combination, those four facts do paint a picture of Jesus' resurrection and divinity. The historical facts support those four facts right there. And so the historical argument to me is the only S-tier argument outside of the teleological argument. And that's why classical apologetics is so popular. If you just use the teleological argument with the historical argument, that is a good case. I think you can add in the cosmological and ontological and make it better. I think for some people, anecdotes can help. The experiential argument, the pragmatic approach, I think can be used, but it's generally not the most intellectually rigorous. And so here we go. And so later in future episodes, we'll do a little bit of breakdowns of each of the individual arguments, maybe do a new list with more arguments, but these are just the general categories of Christian arguments, and here's where they are. Thanks for hopping in.